Hi, welcome to session 3 of the ninth topic of the semester. This is the last topic of the semester that covers Texas in the age of globalization from 1939 to the present. Now, we already covered two sessions. In the first and second sessions, we were looking at the rise of globalization itself, looking at what globalization is, just to have a very general understanding. Again, that the era that we live in today, and we're in the 21st century, by the way, but we are now experiencing on a day-to-day basis what historians and scholars and journalists talk about in terms of the age of globalization. A world that is becoming highly interconnected, interdependent, and there's the sense that because of the information age and because of advanced transportation systems, that the world is growing smaller and smaller, and we're now encountering the cultures of the world on a day-to-day basis again. So again, we talked about that quite extensively. And then we were looking at how Texas is also starting around 1939, 1941, when the Second World War begins and the United States steps in to participate in the Second World War, how Texas is going to now be part of this global stage, so to speak. The experience of Texas has been an isolated province or state in which people were simply living their traditional lives in splendid isolation. That era is now coming to an end because of the age of globalization, again, the interaction of the United States with the rest of the world. That is becoming more and more an active participant, the United States, again, in the world stage. So as the United States moves out around the world, starting with the Second World War, but also with the Cold War that followed after the Second World War, the Cold War that spanned between 1945 and 1991. So it's now inescapable to be dealing with a globalized world. Again, because there's increasing diplomacy, increasing alliances, increasing trade, increasing interactions with the rest of the world. And Texas is part of that experience as well. Something that we covered in the first and second sessions quite extensively. And we at the end of the second session, again, we were also looking at Texas in transition. Okay, we're looking at the period of time between the end of the Second World War all the way to the 1980s again. So Texas during this time is changing in a very significant way. The state itself, the society is going to undergo significant change. It's not just that it's participating again in international trade and so on and so forth, but it's dramatically changing. It's going through a total economic and social and even cultural revolution of sorts. We were talking about the second industrial revolution in Texas, for example. We were looking at a host of different industries that flourished, particularly again after the end of the Second World War, all the way to the 1960s. Again, a host of new enterprises, new industries that is moving more and more Texas towards an industrial economy. Okay. It's not going to do away with an agricultural economy, but it's going to be now moving more and more towards an industrial one during this second industrial revolution that Texas is experiencing. And so the culture is going to change, of course. We're going to see the rise of a middle class in Texas. We were talking about that. College educated professionals that are working in those industries, in those corporations that we just covered, and they're going to recreate their communities in the suburbs, okay? And they're going to really create a culture geared towards social status, for example, social mobility, the idea that what's important in life is for individuals to work very hard to attain a high status in society, to become very well educated, to have a good paying job, to buy a decent house and so on, and to enjoy yourself again through the consumption of goods and services. This consumer culture we were talking about in session 2. So the society is changing. The society is definitely changing in Texas. It's becoming more oriented towards the market, oriented towards the consumption of goods and services, and we see the rise of a middle class as well, with a host of different leisure pastimes and pleasures that the middle class actually enjoy. So again, that gave rise to a lot of venues and some businesses and industries that provided entertainment to the middle class. Okay, so it is really at the end of session 2 that we started talking about another issue that is also going to change Texas society, and that is the civil rights crusade. Again, we're going to see now minorities in Texas becoming more and more organized for the purpose of trying to reform the political institutions, the laws of the state that hinder the ability of certain minority groups to actually access political office or vote or get a good high quality education, a good paying job, to have equal pay, with the dominant groups and so on. And so, again, there's going to be a movement towards equality, so to speak, that, again, minorities are going to be pushing for in this transition. And so this is also going to bring significant change to the state of Texas. So let us look then at the Civil Rights Crusade, so we can now proceed with our discussion. This is our last class, so we do have to make sure to cover all the material that we need, again, to close, again, this topic and to close the semester, by the way. All right, so of course, there's a background we were actually, discussing at the end of session 2. There is a background we were talking about, again, a series of factors like the baby boomer generation. Again, there's a massive population increase that came into the world around this time. That is going to be the one that is going to be making all of the changes. There were, 50 million, human beings born between 1946 and 1959 that had a significant increase in population in the U.S., again, 30%. So this is going to be fundamental in terms of the number of people, that are going to be pondering about the world around them and trying to effect change in the world. There's, again, millions of human beings that are coming at the same time. So that produces change just by itself, just by sheer numbers. All right, so we were discussing also the rise of a new philosophy within the Democratic Party. It's called the New Liberalism, the New Liberals, in other words, the left wing of the Democratic Party, that are redefining democracy as equality. Okay, so they said, well, if we are going to be a democracy, the United States is going to be a democracy, well, we need to create equality, okay, a more equitable society for all citizens, in other words. That's what democracy means. So I discussed that again at the end of session 2. There's also international factors we were talking about, that the legacy of World War II is the fact that minorities, Mexican Americans, African Americans, joined the armed forces to fight racism abroad, the racism of the Nazis and the Japanese. So that had a profound effect, again, in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, because a lot of minorities felt that it was also essential to create the same kind of opportunities here at home that equitable societies fight for. In other words, we were fighting for an justice and an equitable world in which there will be no racism. Well, so this generation is going to say, well, if that's what we were fighting for, so let's create it here at home. Okay. uh, we were fighting for that, abroad. So let's bring it here home as well. Justice and an equitable society for all. And also the pressures of the Cold War. We were talking about how the Cold War is also going to pressure American institutions to change, to become more democratic, because now there is a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to prove to the world which of the two systems are, superior or better, to create a more enjoyable, more fulfilling, more happy existence for human beings. Okay, so if we were advertising democracy as the ideal system, that can create a society in which individuals are going to find fulfillment and happiness. Uh, so again, there was a pressure to actually now become truly democratic, okay? Because there's competition. And the world, of course, watches again. The world is watching as to what countries are doing and so on again. So at any rate, now let's look at the background of the minorities again, the groups that are going to be engaged in this civil rights crusade that is attempting to really bring change to the state of Texas. So I will just focus on the three most important minorities again that are going to have a significant participation in the civil rights crusade, and look at their background in this case. In other words, so what kind of lives they lived in Texas that convinced them that change was necessary. Okay, so so that we can understand, okay, their background, where they're coming from, in other words, okay, why they're going to become so adamant, so active, in the civil rights movement. Okay, so let's start with women, okay, Texas women, the experience of Texas women. And again, this is just a very brief synthesis, again, of what each minority group experienced. This is not an exhaustive, analysis of the entire history of Texas women, but rather just, snapshots that enable us to understand their experiences here in the state. So let's look at the experience of Texas women. Okay, so we have to start with the most fundamental issue, again, that women faced, not only in Texas, but in many parts of the United States and many parts of the world, by the way. And that is the issue, or the legacy, of patriarchy. Okay? Patriarchy. What is patriarchy? Well, patriarchy is any society in which the father rules. Okay? The father. The male figure is the ruler. Patriarchy means rule by the father. Rule by the father. That's what patriarchy means. Rule by the father. So it's really a male-dominated society in which the father figure is the ruler of the family. He is the ruler of society as well. They're the political, leaders. Okay, and patriarchy has existed for literally thousands of years in the world. Okay, so this goes back about 5,000 years. Patriarchy, the rise of a male-dominated world, goes back about 5,000 years ago. So this is a very, very old, legacy that spread all over the planet, and of course, it took hold in Europe, among the Europeans, with the rise of landlords, with the rise of kings, with the rise of emperors, again, and a male-dominated society, and which actually ended up coming to America when the British settled, the 13 colonies. They introduced patriarchy as well. Again, so this goes back really, a long, long time. How women for thousands of years have been subordinated, to men, totally dependent upon men, to the point that depending where we actually look at, again, which part of the world, in some patriarchal societies, women were considered even the property of the male. Again, the actual property, by the way, could be bought and sold and traded and so on. Commercial exchange or arrangements, again, could be made, by using women. Arranged marriages, for example, that was the norm. Women couldn't choose their mate to marry because that was chosen for them by the family, by the father, for family interest purposes. So again, for thousands of years, that was the norm. Uh, so in Texas itself, again, patriarchy found its unique expression in terms of women. We talked about Texas in this case. We're talking about particularly the Spanish period, the Mexican period, and even the American period. By the way, it's pretty much standard. Okay, the Spaniards, the Mexican state, and also the United States. Those societies were patriarchal. In various forms, in various degrees. By the way, but when Texas becomes part of the United States in 1845, okay, the experience of Texas women, in Texas now, again, Texas part of being the U.S., is that women were excluded from voting, for example. Okay, they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold political office. Again, they couldn't be elected to political office as well. They couldn't sit on juries or testify in juries, for example, give a testimony or be part of the jurors, in preaching. Again, they, simply, again, like the religious figures, the religious leaders, the pastors, the ministers in Texas were males. The women were excluded from participating in the church as leaders of the church or a congregation. So that's a long legacy, again, long legacy of patriarchy. Now, of course, the experience of women in Texas also has to be understood in terms of their lives in a state in which still, even up to the early 20th century, Texas was considered to be what is called a frontier society. Okay, a frontier society. So it was a very, very rough, in other words, society that was not very well developed. Texas took a long time to develop, by the way. First with colonization, there were, Americans coming in, or there were immigrant groups coming from different parts of the world to Texas. And it took a long time for the state to develop cities, etc., systems of transportation and the like. It took quite a while. Most people live in the countryside, and people back in the 19th century were facing a lot of hardships, the climate, the environment, hostile Native Americans, for example, like the Comanches, and so on. So life was very rugged. Of course, we also have the presence of outlaws, people running from the law from the United States coming into Texas as well to settle. So this was a very rugged, society called the frontier society. So the frontier, in the very edge of civilization. So life for women was rugged as well, very rough. They had to marry based on survival, on economic survival. Again, there were no love matches per se. Like, okay, look, I'm gonna just marry somebody because I love them. Well, maybe that occurred, but that was not the norm. It was the exception. It was mainly marriage based on survival. Women were rugged, semi-independent. In many cases, they had to rely on their own, not really depend on men, because in many cases, men will die again from wars, from Indian attacks, from disease, from starvation. In many cases, or men will often leave the marriage again, pretty much never to be found ever again. So women had to rely on their own merit or by their own effort. So that's what we mean about semi-independent. Okay, they had to make quick decisions, and in many cases they had to dissolve unions. Whenever they encounter significant problems with the union or marriage. Okay. And so women in Texas very often adopted the role of the male that they had to do what males did in order to survive, because they were not going to wait until a male will come along to protect them and provide. So in many cases, that independence that I'm talking about had to do with uh, women having to provide for themselves, like hunting, for example, farming, ranching, fighting in the frontier. They have to learn how to defend themselves, how to handle a gun, and so on. And whenever there was a war or a fight, again, they had to protect themselves as well. Okay, very, very, again, unique experience. Texas women, again, are very unique in that the historical experience of the frontier shaped their character, okay, their personality, that is to say. The personality of the Texas women is different from the other women of other states because of the frontier. We also see the legacy of World War One and World War Two. We were talking about that as well. Women in Texas entered the workforce during those two world wars because hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of American men actually left their posts, their jobs, to enter the armed forces. Again, they went to fight in Europe or they went to fight in Japan, and so the workforce needed then labor. Okay, there was a shortage of labor that women filled in. Again, there was a void, a vacuum, if you will, of labor that women are going to come in and fill. Okay, and so during World War One and World War Two, we're going to see a massive transformation. Women are going to now become economically more and more self-reliant because now they're earning wages. They have jobs and they can actually provide for themselves. Again, those are the industrial jobs. There were telephone operators, clerical workers, teachers, nurses, librarians. Again, they're gonna not just work in factories. Again, they're going to work in so many different areas of the economy where work was needed. Again, so they're gonna now enter the workforce. Again, so they're not really in Texas. Texas women are not playing the traditional role that other women in other societies play in terms of them staying in the house, and the male is the one that steps out of the house and will become a provider and the like. Again, here women are becoming far more self-reliant. Okay. All right. So that's the legacy again of World War II. And with that, of course, we're going to see in 1920, women now are given the right to vote. Okay, very, very important. The right to vote. Uh, this is also a process by which women were not just given the right to vote per se, but rather they fought for it. Again, there was a women's movement, a feminist movement, women's liberation movement that had been brewing back since the 19th century all over the country. That also in Texas, there were, of course, women that participated in that movement. In that, one of the things that women demanded was the right to vote. Okay, and so by 1920, women were given that particular right. By 1920 now they're participating in voting. There's a major change, and a lot of historians credit the Industrial Revolution. The time when we get to see women entering the industries, in other words, the workforce, as a stepping stone for the right to vote, because they were economically first liberated when they entered the workforce, and with that money, they educated themselves and they went to school, got degrees, they became highly, highly intellectualized to the point that they're now trying to effect change and reform in society. So there will be equity, in other words, equality. equality, in this case, political equality, the right to vote, in other words. Women were very articulate. They could argue, defend themselves, defend their political viewpoints, and they demonstrated, without a shadow of a doubt, that the right to vote had to be given to them because they also constitute an important block of the population that could also affect positive change in the political process. In other words, look, we can actually think about the world and we can actually see what the world needs. In other words, not just men. In other words, look, women can also do that very effectively. And now by 1920, they're actually given the right to vote. They're also voicing their opinions. They're voting again for candidates at the local level, state, and also the national level as well. Okay. But the problem remains in Texas in terms of unequal economic conditions. Okay, that is another legacy again of Texas women, is the fact that for example, within the workforce, it's true it entered the workforce. I mentioned. The fact is that inside of the workforce, there is still in Texas significant discrimination and sexism. For example, when an employer has to let people go, it has to, cut expenses. A department has had to actually reduce the workforce. They often did that by starting with women, for example. Okay, there was, because males back in Texas felt that it was more important for men to be working and providing than women, for example. So they were the first ones to go, and they also, again, endure other forms of discrimination like low pay. They earn less by law, by the way. They earn less than men in their atrocious conditions as well. Okay, so women, of course, by the 1950s, as we'll see, there's going to be, a crusade to eliminate some of those inequitable conditions. Okay, for example, to end discrimination, to end sexism at the workplace, and also low wages, low pay. That they wanted equal pay. That is to say. Okay, so this is very important, again, just to understand, the background of women. Now let's look at Texas Mexicans, okay? Texas Mexicans in this case, all right? So let's look at the background, the experience of Texas Mexicans in the state of Texas. So in this case, again, in this course, we get that the population, again, of Texas really goes back to, first and foremost, the Native Americans, again, that were the original inhabitants of this region that we call Texas. And then came the Spaniards. They settled, again, this province. They gave it a name, Texas, and so on, established missions and forts and so on, And then after the Spaniards, of course, there was the Mexican period. Okay, the Mexican period, the Mexican nation that also Texas was part of. Okay, and so the heirs of the Native Americans and Spaniards, became now Mexicans, if you will, living in the province of Texas. The Mexican population, it was called, the Mexican population, particularly when Mexico, is now in charge of this province. It has sovereignty of this province. So it is particularly, again, the legacy in this case of Santa Anna coming into Texas when Texas was declaring independence from Mexico, that the Mexican population that lived in Texas at this time is going to, for the first time, carry the burden, again, of the actions of the Mexican state. In this case, the Mexican leader was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who came into Texas to quell the rebellion, the independence movement, by going into El Alamo and Goliad and pretty much decimating the entire rebel uh, groups. Again, that amounted to several hundreds in each case. Again, they were all, decimated. Okay, many of them were actually Americans, by the way. Okay, so from this point onwards, again, the Mexican population in Texas, even though Texas becomes independent, is going to carry the burden, again, of the actions of the Mexican state. Again, in this case, the actions of Santa Anna, and is going to be a population that, even though it was trying to fit in into the Texas Republic, and later on is trying to fit it into the state of Texas of the United States, there's still, again, the memories, the lingering memories, again, of El Alamo, so to speak. Okay, the massacre at El Alamo, carried out by the Mexican Santa Anna. Again, so that was not a very easy thing to erase from people's minds in Texas, of course. So the legacy of Santa Anna pretty much started a process of marginalization. Mexicans were marginalized to live in the pretty much on the fringes, if you will, of Texas society, just because there was this trauma, if you will, that people still carry with them, in terms of what the state of Mexico did to Americans, again, in Texas, but also even after Texas becomes independent, the Mexican state continues to exert some form of violence upon the peoples of Texas, because Mexico never really recognized the independence of Texas. So the Mexican state continued to exert a series of violent acts and hostile acts against the people of Texas, that also is going to worsen, worsen the image of the Mexican population, the people of Mexican heritage in the state of Texas, again, in a very significant way. There is going to be, because of those actions, those hostilities, the Mexican state will often send troops into Texas, for example, across the border. There will be border violence, for example, agitation of Indians. The Mexican state agitated the Indians against the Texans, and so on. And there was a lot of Mexican, it's called bandits. There was actually people living in Mexico that came into Texas simply to steal cattle, or called banditry. In other words, they would go into a ranch, plunder the ranch, steal all the cattle, and so on, and move back to the southern border into Mexico. So that also is not going to help very much the image of the Mexican population, or Mexican Americans, again, in Texas, the Texas Mexicans, because of this distrust, the sedition, the acts of agitation, agitating the Indians and so on, and banditry as well. Also, there is also, of course, something that we have to take into account as well, and that is the economic contributions that Texas Mexicans did for the state of Texas, for the development of the state of Texas as well. So this cannot be overlooked. So just like we were explaining about women, how they enter the workforce, they're providing valuable assistance during World War One and World War Two, keeping the economy going in the state by, working in different areas of the economy, keeping industries, factories going and moving and so on. It's important to look that minorities have contributed significantly economically, again, to the development of Texas and also to the development of the United States as a whole. And so in the state of Texas, what we're going to see here is that Texas Mexicans contributed to the development of the Texas state as a very valuable, and almost as well, not only valuable, but also very reliable as well, source of labor as well. So for example, uh, we see, for example, that the development of agricultural companies, again, in the state of Texas, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, okay, there's going to be citrus companies that were growing, of course, citruses. They were growing things like cotton as well. They were growing grain like corn on a massive scale. There's also mining, of course, taking place in Texas, and there's also ranching as well. Okay, that of course the largest cattle ranches are in Texas. By the way, the largest cattle ranches in the United States are in Texas, like the King Ranch in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, the Panhandle. Of course, there's also the ranches there that are gigantic in size. So the Mexican population contributed to the development of the Texas economy because they constituted the bulk of the workforce in those enterprises that were pretty much kickstarting the Texas economy, moving the Texas economy forward, and Texas becoming a more commercial industrial economy, that is to say. Okay, so this is something that we have to take into consideration, the contribution, so to speak, again, that a particular minority group is doing for the economy, again, of a region, the economy of the state and the nation, okay, as well. Uh, we're also going to see the legacy of repatriation. This is an unfortunate chapter in the in the state of Texas. Again, that is not just going to limit, to the experience of Texas, the repatriation that the Mexican population endured in the United States. Of course, was a national experience, not just a state experience. Mexicans were repatriated during the Great Depression on a massive scale. There were millions, again, that were repatriated from all over the country because during the Great Depression, uh, uh, in the initial months and the first years of the Great Depression, when people were suffering and there was, anguish, economic anxiety and anguish and pain, very often what people do, and this is just human nature, is human nature, by the way, is that people look uh, for people, for those responsible, in other words. People often try to identify the source of this pain. And so very often what human beings, what we do is that we tend to point fingers again at other people, other groups to blame them for our misfortunes. So that's exactly what happened here during the Great Depression. The Mexicans, again, were in many cases identified as one of the sources for the problems of the Great Depression because there were about 3 million uh, Mexicans that came into the United States from 1870 to 1920. And by the 1930s, the Great Depression, people felt that, well, maybe this is part of the problem again. It's got a lot of immigration and so on. So we have a repatriation now program for Mexicans in which they were, in Texas alone, there were about 250,000 that were sent back to Mexico, and at that point, Texas had about 500,000, Mexicans living in Texas, but, half of them were actually sent back to Mexico during this time. Just 1 second. All right. So now that's very important because this is part of the experience again of the Mexican population in Texas. Okay, the repatriation. Now, number 5 is the participation in World War II. Uh, Now, Texas Mexicans participated in World War II in two distinct ways. I would just like to write them here. One is that they joined the U.S. forces. Okay, that's number one. There was a significant number of Texas Mexicans that actually joined the army again to fight in the Second World War. But also during World War II, there was a scarcity of agricultural labor in Texas. And it was a scarcity of agricultural labor really in the United States as a whole, because there were also millions of American farmers that joined the armed forces to go fight again in Europe, to fight in Japan. Okay. So many farms, thousands upon thousands of farms were pretty much left empty, if you will, of labor. Because American males, again, for the most part, again, they now became soldiers. And so there was the need to actually grow food for the nation and to grow food for the troops as well. Okay. And so, because there was a scarcity of labor, the United States and Mexico signed a program called the Bracero Program. Okay. The Bracero Program was simply, again, a program by which Mexico agreed to send hundreds of thousands, eventually millions, of Mexican workers into the United States to grow food like grain, wheat, corn, vegetables, including, of course, things like cotton and other products, again, for the American economy that was at war. And it was essential to have all the needed materials, all the food supplies, to sustain the war, not only here at home, but also abroad. And Mexicans were doing that, through the Bracero program. We're going to see a significant now influx of Mexicans coming into Texas under the Bracero program to grow food in agricultural companies for the most part, but also in many farms as well, okay, that were left vacant. All right, so number six, the other, of course, issue with the Mexican population in Texas is that as we move into the 1950s and 60s, we're going to see now a more conscious, more aware Mexican American population of their own participation, their own contribution in the development of the Texas state and the development of the United States as a whole. So we're going to see the development of what's called Mexican activism. Okay, Mexican activism in terms of Mexican Americans forming their own associations again for self-representation, for mutual aid, and so on, and trying to pretty much provide a voice again to the state, a voice to the nation that will tell society again of the needs of the Mexican American population again in this case. Okay, so. Uh, so one of the organizations that Mexican Americans formed was called LULAC, the League of Latin American Citizens, in the 1960s. This was an organization founded by members of the middle class that wanted simply the same opportunities to the Mexican American population that the mainstream society had. Okay, the same opportunities for good education, for good work, etc. And because this was a middle class, this is most a business-driven, organization. They said that this organization said that, well, we're willing really to acculturate. We're willing to adopt the culture of the United States, the language, the traditions, the way of life, completely fully, but we would like to be treated equally. In other words, they were not necessarily, nationalist in terms of them, saying that they were proud of being Mexican and so on, but rather the LULAC organization was simply voicing that, that they agreed again with the mainstream culture of the United States, with the English language, with English history, traditions, and the like, but they were willing to acculturate, fully as possible, but to be given, of course, equal representation, equal opportunity as well. All right, so that's LULAC, the first organization. And there's going to be another organization that was like the counterpart, another movement that was like the counterpart of LULAC, that was formed by, for the most part, Mexican American intellectuals. Those were actually, in many cases, college or university professors, but also there were really people coming from the barrios, from the neighborhoods as well, that had some also education as well. Many of them were teachers, by the way, that created their own movement in the 1960s, Mexican American movement called the Chicano movement. Okay. And this movement, again, the Chicano movement, is going to instead look at ancient Mexico, for inspiration. All right. That the Chicanos are saying, we feel very proud that we descend from one of the uh, most advanced civilizations of the Americas, the Aztecs, they will say. Okay. So instead of saying, yeah, we're willing to acculturate, we're willing to drop the Spanish language and become fully Americans, the Chicanos are saying, wait a minute. Okay. So we feel very proud of being Mexicans. We feel very proud of having indigenous heritage. Okay. The Aztecs were indigenous groups, again, of ancient Mexico, by the way, that built pyramids. They follow the, calendars that mark the movements of the sun and the moon and the planets very accurately. They were astronomers. They were mathematicians. They were highly intelligent, in other words. So the Chicanos were saying that, that they instead want to create an identity in which Mexicans can feel very proud about being Mexicans because they descend from this ancient civilization, again, the Aztecs. Okay. And so they felt very proud about that. They wanted to bring back Aztec imagery, Aztec art, Aztec mathematics, Aztec philosophy, and so on. It's almost like they're rediscovering, the ancient Aztecs and in the Mexican population in Texas and in the United States. And so they really feel that this is the way that they really want to carry on, their own identity in the United States. They don't want to lose any links to the past, they said. Okay? Yeah, we're in a different country that has a different culture and a different language, but we hereby say that the way that we are going to survive as a people is to maintain our link to the past, to the ancient Aztecs, which is going to give us identity. It's going to give us inspiration. It's going to give us a vision to move forward, in other words. And they rejected all forms of accommodations. Accommodationists, are people that are simply trying to fit in the mainstream American culture. People that want to drop Spanish and just speak English, for example. Those are accommodationists, in other words. People that want to abandon their own traditions in favor of a foreign culture. Those are accommodationists. They're saying, no, we reject that. In other words, we feel very proud about being Mexicans and so on. And eventually the Chicanos are going to actually create a third party, okay? In the United States, in the Southwest, in places like Texas again, we're going to see that the Chicanos are going to create a party called the Raza Unida Party, okay? A Raza Unida Party. So what is the Raza Unida Party? Well, it is really, again, a party in which it was actually founded by a Chicano, okay? It's a Chicano party by Jose Angel Gutierrez in Texas. That is going to embody really the vision of the Chicano movement, based on Aztec culture, the Aztec history, the Aztec past, and trying to bring together all Mexicans under this single idea again, that we're a united race. That's what a Raza Unida is. Raza Unida is a united race. In other words, that we just need to come to terms that we all share the same ancestors. Yeah, we also have different heritage, of course. We have Spanish heritage and so on. It is true. But for the most part, we really go back to the Aztecs. Okay, I mean, still in our blood. So let's have that identity. So the Raza Unida Party was trying to simply create a common identity about, among the Texas Mexicans, so people can actually see themselves as a single group, in other words. Okay, so they can unite their wills, unite their forces, come together and work as a single people, that is to say. It is in Crystal City, in Texas, that this party actually has some impact. Okay, the members of this party were really creating significant change in the city, in Crystal City. It won seats in the city school board, for example, members of the Raza Unida party. And they introduced things like, for example, a free lunch program as well. Okay, in that city. Again, it's not going to survive for long. It actually disintegrated by the 1970s, but you can tell here that, again, this population, the Mexican American population in Texas, is becoming highly organized and politicized as well. Just one second. There's also going to be the experience of Black Texans. Okay, the experience of Black Texans in this case. Okay, so you still have some time here. Okay, so just like women, Mexican Americans, is also going to be the experience of Black Texans. Again, the experience of Black Texans goes back to the legacy of slavery that has been going on for 400 years. When the Europeans began arriving to the African shores of the West Coast and bringing African slaves to the Americas for the purpose of growing a series of cash crops in plantations. Again, so plantation economies across the Americas. There will be thousands of plantations that the Europeans are going to set up, in which the slaves were the ones that were actually growing a series of cash crops, that were highly valuable in the world market at the time. Things like tobacco, sugar, rice, for example, coffee, and of course, cotton. Okay, sorry, cotton. Okay, so it is particularly, again, in Texas that we see the introduction of plantations as early as the 1820s and 1830s. There will be southern planters that moved into Texas through the colonization policies of Mexico during that time. And they began to actually establish a series of cotton plantations along the northeast and eastern boundary, again, of between Texas and Louisiana, and along the Gulf Coast region as well. Again, cotton agriculture. So they brought, of course, their slaves as well. Okay, they were growing cotton in Texas, very profitable crop, by the way, for the Industrial Revolution taking place in the world. And again, the African slaves were the ones that were actually growing the cotton, by the way, okay, in the state of Texas, cotton agriculture. And cotton agriculture will become central to the state, by the way, okay? The entire Texas economy throughout the 19th century and early 20th century was a cotton economy. There's no doubt about that, okay? King Cotton, okay? And it was before the Civil War that the slaves were actually growing the cotton again for plantation owners. Also, urban development. The fact is that the construction of the main urban centers in Texas, places like Houston, for example, Galveston, particularly, again, in the eastern side of Texas, many of the settlements, many of the towns were actually built through slave labor as well. They were the ones building the houses, the roads, clearing land, and they were the ones building bridges, warehouses, barns, and the like. Okay, so again, urban development. We got that as well. Construction work, that is to say, okay, for building the first cities of Texas, and of course, the financial system as well. Okay, the financial system of Texas depended upon slavery. In other words, that slaves were used for financial transactions. They were used to, for example, extend loans. Banks often extended loans to people that own slaves. Again, it was a source of credit, instantaneous credit. If people own slaves, they could be, given loans, in other words, instantaneously, because they had labor, at their disposal. That was always generating revenues for them. So it was more than likely they're going to be able to pay back the loan. In other words, that's why banks often chose, again, slave owners as the source, the recipients, again, of most of the loans in Texas, of course. Okay, so that's another thing, again, that even the development of a financial system in Texas was largely due to the presence of African slaves as well. Okay, uh, now of course there's going to be the Civil War. We cover that. We're not going to repeat all of that here. There were, of course, after the Civil War, when the South was defeated, there were 4 million slaves all over the South that were liberated. In the state of Texas, the experience of the free population, the African Americans now that have been given citizenship, was that they continue even after the Civil War, throughout the remaining portion of the 19th century, let's say from 1865 all the way to the end of the century, to continue to be subordinated to the former masters. In many cases, many of them actually ended up returning to the plantation to work for wages, for example. And they also endured persecution as well. And that was, the common experience, in for African Americans in Texas. Okay, persecution, particularly, the KKK again, waves of violence by the KKK against the African American population. That was another, of course, issue that they endured. Okay. Okay. So number two is the legacy of segregation. Okay. The African American population, particularly after Reconstruction, after 1877, are going to be segregated by laws that the state of Texas enacted. Texas was not the only one, by the way. It was a series of states across the country, again, particularly in the South, that introduced laws to segregate the white and black population in this case. Okay, so it is in 1896 that the Supreme Court actually made it totally legal to segregate. In other words, it actually wrote a blank check to the states saying, look, if you are segregating, well, that's not really against the law. You're not violating the Constitution, again, because you're segregating. Again, this is something that the Supreme Court actually did in 1896. Okay? It brought about what is called separate but equal, that states can introduce laws to segregate the racial groups that they call, again, based on color, as long as each group had accommodations and facility provided to them. In other words, as long as people are granted separate but equal accommodations or facilities, then everything's fine. Again, it's totally legal to segregate, in other words. Okay? So those laws that now from here on, the state of Texas, as well as other states, are going to start writing. Once the Supreme Court gave them a green light, so to speak, to segregate with that decision, again, in 1896, those laws were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, the segregation of public and private facilities. So in the state of Texas, Jim Crow laws, segregation, that is to say, those are state laws to segregate. It pretty much segregated Texas society through and through in terms of schools, churches, parks, buses, trains, waiting rooms, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, drinking fountains, and other public accommodations were all segregated. Those were Jim Crow laws again that the state of Texas felt totally now okay with the Supreme Court, giving them, of course, now a green light that this is totally constitutional, is lawful to do. So we have a segregated now society in the state of Texas. Okay, just a second. All right, so that is, I'm sorry, that is the legacy again of segregation. So it's a segregated community, okay, the African American community in Texas. Uh, as we move into the early 20th century, after 1896, again, that's the end of the 19th century. So we opened up the 20th century with segregation, that is to say, okay, a segregated society. Okay, so uh, now let's look at another issue, of course, and the issue is that the African American community in Texas also uh, experienced the legacy, if you will, okay, the actions, the policies of the Democratic Party, which was actually the party of the South. Again, the Democratic Party was the party of the Confederacy, so to speak, that seceded from the Union and fought in the Civil War to preserve slavery. So the Democratic Party was the party, again, of the slave owners that wanted to perpetuate uh, slavery in 1860 when he left the Union. And after the Civil War and Reconstruction comes to an end, the Democratic Party comes once again back in power in Texas, and now not necessarily as the party of slavery, but as the party of segregation. The party of segregation. So again, the Democratic Party, again in Texas, in the early part of the 20th century, particularly all the way to the 1960s, by the way. So was really the party of what is called race politics, that is to say, okay, endorsing what is called white supremacy, okay, endorsing white supremacy, particularly after the rise of populism. We cover that. Populism in the 1880s and 90s was a popular movement that was trying to bring together people of all colors, again, of all ethnicities, of all backgrounds, just based on class. In other words, if you're part of the lower class, we should get together and really, form a political force. It's called populism, disregarding race altogether. And populism was really growing, in Texas, because people were now coming to terms with the reality that it was really, class that was actually more important than race. Okay? Because again, it doesn't matter, the color of your skin, your background, people very often, again, are exploited by the same groups, in other words. Okay. So, of course, after populism, the Democratic Party is trying to do away with populism, in other words, and trying to instead prevent the poor from accessing, political office. The poor, in which that case that included, of course, a number of different ethnic minorities, like African Americans and Mexican Americans, because they were part of the lower class. So how to exclude then the poor from participating in politics, to exclude them from political office, again, is by charging to vote. It's called the poll tax in 1902 in Texas. In order to vote, you needed to actually pay a registration, voter registration. You pay a huge amount of money just to vote. So that excluded, of course, the poor, the populace, in other words, the poor, the lower class, people that were poor, period. That, of course, targeted, in this case, ethnic minorities were excluded from the political process. Okay. We also have, of course, the Democratic Party introducing what is called white primaries, the terror election laws of 1903 and 1907. So what it is, again, the white primaries is that now there will be people that are going to choose their candidates every time there's going to be an election, that the people will have to actually choose the candidates that they want to run for office at the local level or state level and so on. So what the Democratic Party did is that it made it a requisite under those laws that in order to attend the primaries, you needed to be white, in other words. So non-whites were excluded from actually participating in primaries. This is, again, when people get together, again, in conventions to choose their candidate, that is to say. And again, those are the terror election laws, again, of 1903 and 1907. And also, in the state of Texas, we got another issue called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering has been practiced literally since the 1790s, by the way, 1790s in the United States. It was first actually practiced in Massachusetts. It was the first, place where it was actually practiced gerrymandering. But in the state of Texas, gerrymandering, let me explain what it is. It was based on ethnicity. What it is you form districts, okay? You form certain districts. You look at the state and you say, look, we have to draw the map and actually indicate which are going to be the districts. There's a series of districts that the state is divided into. And so when you divide the districts based on politics, that you say, okay, which are, for example, the districts that that the people, okay, that vote, let's say, Democrat, okay, which are the regions in which the largest concentration of Democrats live. And so what you do is that you draw a line and say, okay, this is going to be a district. All the people that vote Democrat in the state of Texas, again, now they're all grouped together under one district. And where you see that there's other communities, like ethnic communities that don't vote Democrat, okay, like African Americans, for example, you also draw districts again there. You say, this is another district. So whenever there's an election, okay, what gerrymandering is, whenever there's an election, you're going to simply just take into account the votes from the districts that favor your political party. And the other ones, you're not going to count them, in other words, okay? You're not going to even count them, whatever it is, okay? So at the end of the day, you're going to make sure that the Democratic Party, will always be in office because, you're only concentrating the pockets of population that are favoring your party. You draw a district, you take elections, you only count the votes from that district. It's called gerrymandering. There's many forms of gerrymandering, by the way. But that's another issue, is that there's gerrymandering taking place in the state of Texas that hinders the ability of African Americans from actually, choosing candidates that are not necessarily from the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in Texas is the party, again, of segregation, okay? And white supremacy as well. So, of course, African Americans don't vote Democrat, but that doesn't matter because of gerrymandering, the way the districts are formed, in other words, and the way votes are counted as well. So that's another issue. Of course, there's also the development of black activism in Texas. Just like Mexicans, of course, we're going to see black activism, they're going to create their own associations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. That is also going to be defending the rights of African Americans, in many cases protecting them in legal cases, issuing legal suits whenever there were violations of rights. Again, they're going to be, of course, providing valuable counseling and assistance to the African American community. There's also going to be associations like the Progressive Voters League and Texas Club of Democratic Voters that were trying to protect the black vote, again, black voting rights, anti-discrimination. And in many cases, those associations, in many cases, also integrated whites as well. There were black and whites that were coming together to try to effect change in the state of Texas. In many cases, black and white students were the ones protesting in college and university campus to desegregate, for example. Okay, so again, there was not only, again, totally 100% divided along ethnic lines. We're going to see also, again, there's going to be a significant number of liberal-minded individuals, white individuals, again, in Texas that are going to sympathize and help, in this case, the African American community. So let's look at a cascade of civil rights legislation. Now that we looked at the background of minorities like women, Mexican Americans, and African Americans, now let's look at civil rights legislation. Legislation that is coming from both at the national level, but also at the state level, that we're trying to build an equitable society. Because now there's organizations, okay? The Mexican Americans, African Americans, women are becoming highly organized. They're coming together and trying to push for change, again, in this political system to gain equality. Equality, that's the key word. Okay, so desegregation and equity. This is what really the civil rights legislation was trying to accomplish, to desegregate society, to integrate, again, all communities, have equal access, again, to public facilities and private facilities as well, and equity, to be treated equally, again, that all peoples, all citizens, regardless of race, color, sex, nationality, religion, creed, background, again, will be treated equally before the law. Okay, so we start with the public school system in 1954, the desegregation of public schools in 1954. This is when the Supreme Court overturned segregation, again, in a legendary classic Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education at Topeka. It happened in Kansas. Again, this is a lawsuit, that Mr. Brown, Oliver Brown, issued against the Board of Education at Topeka for the private enrollment to his 9-year-old daughter because of segregation policies in Kansas. And so this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with Mr. Brown, the father, saying that the Board of Education was violating the Constitution, the 14th Amendment that clearly states that no state should limit any of the privileges and immunities that the Constitution grants to all citizens born in the United States, that all citizens should be treated equally, that is to say. So the Warren Court, in the Supreme Court, was now in the hands of Warren, the Chief Justice Warren, Earl Warren, who's very liberal oriented. He declares separate but equal unconstitutional. In other words, Jim Crow laws that segregate society, by using separate but equal facilities, that all of that is unconstitutional, that is to say. So they ordered the desegregation of the public school systems, under that ruling. The desegregating of city buses, we're going to see that in 1956, the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled against segregation in city buses as well. Those are public transportation systems. Might be run by the city, might be run by a private company, but is illegal to segregate the seats, to separate, that there's a seating for, minorities in one side of the aisle, whereas in the other is for, for whites, for example. Okay. So that is, of course, is ruled against, the segregation. Women's rights, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 forbid employers paying different wages for equal work based on sex. Okay, so women, again, now have the rights to be treated equally at the workplace, to be paid equally for the same work done by men. Okay? So, again, is the Equal Pay Act. And also Roe versus Wade in 1972 also addressed the issue of women's rights and legalized abortion and women's rights to choose. That is to say, that women were now in control of their own bodies. They were sovereign, in other words, to decide what to do with their bodies and not necessarily be controlled by men. In other words, what men indicate or want women to do with their bodies. In other words, Roe versus Wade in 1972. All right. So we got also the Great Society legislation under Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. He launches the civil rights legislation in 1964. He was actually from Texas. He's a Texas Democrat, but he's very liberal. Okay. And he launches what is called the Civil Rights Act in 1964, in barring segregation. He's part of the new liberals that I just mentioned again in the end of session 2 and beginning of session 3. This session, the new liberal, in other words, believing in equality. So the Civil Rights Act bars segregation in public facilities. Okay, in all public facilities, it forbade employers to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, sex, and national origin. And Title VII of this act guarantees women legal protection against discrimination at the workplace as well. Okay, it guarantees. The 14th Amendment, the 24th Amendment was also passed under LBJ, banned poll taxes for voting. You can no longer charge for voting, in other words, okay? So the system becomes more equitable, in other words, okay? The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests and other voting restrictions, okay? So no more literacy tests to vote. There's not going to be any requisite, you know, you don't have to have, education in order to vote. You can just vote, in other words. That's your right as a citizen. And federal supervision of elections in black districts as well, okay? And then we got the War on Poverty legislation, Medicaid, 1965, healthcare for the poor, Medicare, in 1965, healthcare for the elderly and disabled, and also aid to families with dependent children as well. Again, it's called a part of the War on Poverty legislation. Okay, the AFDC, again, aid to families with dependent children, and also food stamps as well. Okay, so there's a series of laws that were trying to desegregate and also create a more equitable society. And the effects of the civil rights in Texas, however, is that this is going to really create significant radical change, in the state of Texas, as the Democratic Party is moving way too far to the left. In other words, okay, the party of segregation, the party of white supremacy. Now, the Democratic Party, LBJ is a Democrat, by the way. Now this party is moving way to the left. It's desegregating. It's providing equality, not supremacy, to one group, equality for all peoples, in other words. So, of course, this is going to have dramatic repercussions in the state of Texas, because one of the repercussions is that Texas is going to transition into a two-party state, okay? We're going to see now the rise of the Republican Party, okay? Even though it existed in Texas already, it was, again, pretty much, Texas was a one-party state, okay? Because the Democrats have been in office ever since the end of Reconstruction, okay? It was the same party all along, again. But this 1960s is changing party politics, because the Democratic Party at the national level is changing, okay? It's rebranding itself, okay? The new liberalism, of course, and the civil rights, was part of that. They say, well, there's a lot of new liberals in this party that are pushing for civil rights. Look at the president, LBJ, he is a Democrat. He's part of the new liberals, in other words. He's adopting the new liberalism. So Texas Democrats are not very happy with that, of course. And the Democratic Party is now including minorities. So this is becoming now the party of minorities. So, of course, conservative Texas Democrats are going to flee the Democratic Party in huge numbers. Okay? Conservative Texas Democrats are going to simply now join the Republican Party, because they see the Republican Party as the conservative party, that is to say. So we see a transformation, again, of the political parties in Texas. That is going to change the party politics, okay? In terms of, now there's going to be competition, okay? Because all of the conservative Texas Democrats are flocking to the Republican Party, and they're going to now use the Republican Party as what the Democratic Party was in the past. In other words, that they're now thinking that this is the conservative party of limited government, limited taxes, for example, limited public services, like assistance, to minorities and such, and also the party of segregation and white supremacy as well. Okay, so they're flocking now to this party, by the way. In 1979, as a matter of fact, the Republican Party is going to grow significantly from being just a minor party, by the way. Now it's growing in Texas. That the candidate William Clements won the election of 1979. This is mind-boggling. Again, this is the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. So again, now the civil rights movement did that. The civil rights movement is changing the politics of Texas. Okay, he's going to uh, uh, just come in for one term and try to enact conservative policies. Okay, tougher law enforcement, for example. Okay, tougher law enforcement, reduce the size of the federal government. You know, like cutting, the programs and so on. That the federal government was just way too big. It was trying to reduce the amount of assistance. In other words, all of the agencies that providing assistance to people, that is trying to reduce that as well. It's a conservative party that is coming into office. Now, in the election of 1893, we see once again the Democrats, the liberal Democrats. Remember, the Democrats are now becoming more and more liberal. Okay, they win the governorship once again. Mark White becomes now the liberal Democrat governor in 1893. Healthcare for the poor, providing also healthcare for retired teachers. He introduces the mandatory seatbelt in the state of Texas, workers' compensation when workers suffer accidents at the workplace to be compensated for their, medical expenses. Uh, Unemployment insurance for farm workers as well, and education reforms. So what we see here is that now Texas, the party politics are becoming just like, for example, what it is today. Okay, the Republican Party is the conservative party, and the Democratic Party is the liberal party. That is to say, that reaches out to the working class, to minorities, etc. Again, uh, and again, the situation from 1978 to 1994 is that the two parties were alternated back and forth. In every election, the party in office will be ousted by the opposition party, and vice versa. Every election, there's going to be an alternation between Democrats, Republicans again. So we see more competition, that is to say. But what this really is doing is that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are now getting a very firm grip about what their constituency is, who are their supporters, the popular base again. The Democratic Party, in Texas are supported by the inner city, people living in the inner city, for example, and minority voters. Okay, African Americans, Mexican Americans, for the most part, again, vote Democrat. Again, not 100%, but again, it's a substantial number in people that live in the inner city as well. Okay, the Republican Party are supported by people that live in the suburbs. Okay, a highly professional class, managerial class, people in West Texas, all of West Texas, and rural East Texas are going to be voting solid Republican again, which in the past they used to be voting solid Democrat, when the Democratic Party before the 1960s movement was the party of the Deep South. That is to say, very traditional, very conservative in their policies, limited government, limited taxes, limited, public support or aid, to people services, what's called public services and so on. Now, this last part is going to be rather short. Again, it's just looking at the new Texas from 1986 to 2012, thereabout. Again, so very quickly, just to kind of take a glance about what Texas is going to look like as we move now into more contemporary times. Again, now that we have understood how Texas changed, during the transition stage between the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Now, uh, as we move into the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s again, Texas is going to change also again into something quite more familiar to us, the way do we actually recognize it. For example, number one, Texas, the oil industry is going to be affected in very significant ways in the 1980s. There was what is called an oil bust again in the 1980s. that is going to affect the oil industry in Texas. It was dominant up to this time. Oil in Texas, I mentioned in the past, how it flourished. It became the backbone of the Texas economy. But by the 1980s, again, oil prices were affected worldwide with the rise of a new organization called the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, in other words. There's a series of countries, again, some of which are in uh, the Middle East, other are in Latin America as well, that came together to form, an organization of oil producing, oil exporting countries. And so what they're going to do in the 1980s is that they're not going to abide by any type of market analysis in trying to maintain prices. They're simply going to mass produce and overproduce as much as possible. So they flooded the world market with so much oil that we're going to see again prices falling down in a very significant way. In the 1980s, it fell from $40 a barrel to $10 a barrel. So again, that affected, of course, the oil industry in Texas because it used to be quite profitable. $40 a barrel. Texas was booming the economy because of that. But now it goes back to $10 a barrel. Okay. It will recover quite slightly as we move into the 1990s to about $22 a barrel, but it did not recover the levels that, again, it was had, $40 a barrel. So Texas lost significant revenues because it was, revenues were coming from taxes of oil sales, oil exports, oil related industrial production activities. Again, that's how Texas actually funded the state. But now this industry is in decline, so to speak. And there were about 282,000 jobs that were lost during this oil bust. So what that did was that Texas therefore had to diversify, okay, the economy instead of relying like on oil. In the past it was cotton. By the way, the 19th century, early 20th century was cotton. King cotton. The entire Texas economy was sustained through this single crop. But it moved into oil. We talked about that by the 1940s and 50s and 60s, an oil-based economy. But now with this oil bust, then the state of Texas, the Texas economy had to diversify. In other words, look, we have to build a series of different industries and enterprises from which to sustain the state economy. We can no longer rely on one anymore. Okay, so there were a host of new industries again that the Texas economy is going to rely on: transportation industries, utilities, construction companies, construction work, finance as well. We're going to see the proliferation of banks, financial institutions, and retail trade as well. Retail trade. So again, it's becoming more diversified, and so it's going to be the high-tech industries. Dell Company and Compaq are Texas industries again that are also flourishing during this period of time from 1986 to 2012 again. And that now we got, of course, high tech as well, industries as well, computer industries. Okay, and also we're going to see the rise of a service sector economy, a service sector economy, and more. As a matter of fact, even today, the U.S. economy is moving to a service sector economy because a lot of industries have left already, to Mexico, to China, and so on. That with this massive deindustrialization that the United States has gone through, therefore many Americans have to create, of course, enterprises, businesses of their own. So many of those enterprises, businesses are in the service sector. For example, health related services, telecommunications, retail, and even today, for example, the restaurant sector is another very important, service sector that the economy is relying more and more. Okay. Uh, Last but not least is the changing demographics. The population of Texas is changing very dramatically, not only of Texas, but of the entire United States. But here, you're just looking at Texas. there has been significant migrations taking place, okay, to the state of Texas from within the United States, particularly, but also from abroad. Okay, by 2011, for example, only 52% of the people living in Texas were considered native Texans. Imagine. No, only 54%, because 46% are immigrants or migrants. Those are people coming from, you know, the north part of the country, for example, places like New York, the Ohio Valley, for example. There's now people coming from California as well. But also there's people coming from Asia. There's also people coming from Latin America. Okay. By this time, 3% of Texas society are Asians, 12% African American, and 38 are Hispanic. This is a growing population. The Hispanic population, again, is experiencing a boom. The Hispanic population boom, in other words. This is a growing population. So it's no longer necessarily a minority. It is forecasted by the year 2050, the Mexican American population will perhaps become the majority of the state of Texas, by the way, just the state of Texas alone. So, how to explain this? Why is it that we have a Hispanic population boom in the state of Texas, as well as in other parts of the country, by the way? Well, one particular factor deals with a treaty signed in 1993 between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Again, this is a treaty, a commercial treaty of free trade between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico for pretty much removing all trade barriers and trying to pretty much trade freely back and forth. So, in the beginning, there was great expectations as to how those three countries were going to become more and more integrated commercially, economically. So there were great hopes about, the possibilities of a better future. But and from the perspective of Mexico, just for Mexico alone, what happens is that now that American farmers can simply export grain in such a large quantities into Mexico. Mexico did not import grain in the past. The Mexican peasantry were the ones growing actually all of the food from Mexico, like beans and squash, vegetables, corn, you name it. Okay. But now that American farmers have access to the market in Mexico, they can just, under NAFTA, just flood the market with corn. So this is going to drive out a lot of Mexican farmers and peasants out of business. They cannot compete with American farmers that have technologies, that have fertilizers and so on. They're not going to compete with them. So many of them are actually selling their land because they're going broke and they're leaving the countryside. There's Mexican landless peasants now migrating to the cities of Mexico, but also they're migrating to the United States in search for work, because their livelihood was totally shattered, by the free trade agreement, by NAFTA, of course. They cannot compete again with high-tech farmers like the United States, for example. There's also a series of economic crises affecting Latin America, not only Mexico since the 1980s. There's devaluations taking place, economic crises of various sorts in places like Argentina, in Central America, South America, Mexico. And that, of course, pushes a lot of people as well to leave their countries in search for opportunities in another country, like the United States. This is why there's also an influx, again, of people coming from Latin America into Texas as well. The economic crises, again, the economic instability of the currencies in Latin America are making it harder and harder for people to sustain themselves as well. And also, last but not least, another reason why we have this Hispanic population boom, again, deals with the violence in Latin America as well. Okay, there's two kinds of violences, by the way. One is the guerrillas. Okay, the guerrillas are simply armed groups, paramilitary groups that are fighting the state. Okay, in places like Central America, for example. Okay, there's civil wars. Okay, that's what it is. And there's small factions that are trying to compete for control of territories or sections of the country. That is to say, and of course, there's endemic violence again in the countryside, particularly places like, for example, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, for example, in Central America, that forces people to leave their homeland because, again, of the guerrillas. There's factions that move in and they're very violent, and sometimes they steal your food and so on. And there's, of course, if people are forced to leave that climate of violence, and many of them actually end up coming to the United States, by the way. It is also the issue of the drug war. Okay, the war on drugs, for example, that is trying to limit again the ability of the drug cartels of Latin America to import drugs into the United States, has also been an issue because in Mexico, starting in the year 2003, the Mexican cartels are beginning to fight inside of Mexico over routes and territories. And there has been a kind of like a civil war in which the main factions that are fighting in Mexico, again, are actually the drug cartels. Again, so it's a drug war of sorts from 2003. And so that has also pushed a lot of people, from Mexico into the United States because, again, it's just horrific the way those cartels actually fight, again, in the main streets of Mexico. Again, it's a lot of people that have died. Just from 2006 to 2012, there were about 1 million, people in Mexico that died for the drug war. So that is also like a push factor, if you will, that forces people to escape the violence, again, the endemic violence in Mexico, and many of them end up, again, coming to Texas as well. So we're seeing, again, a boom in the population in Texas. So this is all I have for you. This is the end of this course. We're not just closing this topic, we're also ending the semester. We have arrived, roughly speaking, to the 2000s, just trying to take a glance at some of the changes that have transpired in contemporary Texas, by the way. But this is all I have for you. I hope you have learned and understood the history of Texas in a more comprehensive way, looking at all of the different backgrounds, the Native American background, the Spanish background, the Mexican background, the American background, and of course, the background of globalization. All of those were influences that have shaped the history of the state, and we have seen that in different topics going one by one again. How is slowly but surely the peoples of Texas, the state, has been molded by so many different influences, again, that have weaved together the culture, the society of the state. Okay, so that's all I have for you. Thank you for your time. And this is, once again, the end of this course. Thank you.